always a wonderful pleasure to have an invitation from this fabulous organization and to spend some time with the terrific people of MOSAIC. And the work that this community does is absolutely the foundation of successful immigration for Canada and for this province. And in the contemporary political climate, it's getting harder and harder to do this work. So around the world, migration has become increasingly politically contentious in the 21st century. And I've been arguing for some time now that we can sum up the contemporary politics of immigration by stating that the settler society era has ended, and there's no longer any particular difference in immigration politics between those countries like ours that were founded through successive waves of immigration and those countries that were traditionally migrant-sending countries. So this evening I want to talk a little bit about the contours of the contemporary politics of migration and to think in particular about the past 2 or 3 years here in Canada. So the main reason to talk about the end of the settler society framework is that many people simply don't believe it. And the shift away from a settler society perspective on immigration is particularly important for states like ours that have a mythology of being founded on immigration. Understanding that in immigration terms, a settler society era is over is vital for understanding how politics work in countries like ours, and also really useful for understanding how politics work in other states, particularly those prosperous Western liberal democracies, which were once the main senders of these waves of immigration that have arrived here. So this is not to say that Canada's encounter with Indigenous peoples is not still very much locked in a settler colonial perspective, but rather to say that we're at a moment where an emphasis in that relationship is really on the overhang of the colonial and the way in which colonial practices carry forward. And that the settler aspect is sort of locked down in that dyad rather than moving forward in the same way it was before. So an important question, obviously, is why does this matter? Why bother to challenge immigration mythology? And what does a challenge offer aside from pessimism and possibly some clever rhetoric? The answer is that immigration politics are deeply resistant to change. And change is desperately needed, as this group knows more than any other. On every side of current immigration politics, settler society mythology persists. And by this I mean a background vision of hardworking immigrants who come to a new place, who set down roots and rebuild their lives, who make better lives for their children, and at the core contribute at great personal cost to the building of a new nation. Now this is of course still true. For those of us who advocate on behalf of immigrants and refugees, the importance of this mythology is a powerful call to what is really best about our past approaches to immigration. So we conjure these images and tell this story in order to persuade policymakers, judges, politicians, that we ought to return to a time when we treated immigrants differently, when we thought about these values of permanence and setting down roots and making things better for the next generation as a core of our policy. So continuing to embrace this story helps advocate for a time when things were better in the past. It's a compelling story. We'd be foolish to abandon it as advocates entirely. But think about it from the other perspective. On the other hand, for those who seek to impose ever harsher immigration laws, ever more rigid restrictions, ever higher walls, the old mythology of the settler society provides a measure against which today's newcomers are failing. Whether the story is that newcomers refuse to integrate, or that they're so wealthy that they're distorting the real estate market, or that they're not economically successful, or that qualified doctors and engineers are now taxi drivers, and if they weren't in Vancouver, they'd be Uber drivers. The story's the same. They're not living up to the immigration imaginary of the past. And in this particular telling, this version, the settler society mythology provides a justification for meaner policy measures because it demonstrates that what we're currently doing is somehow not working. It obscures the fact that the results policymakers complain of are entirely a predictable outcome of the ways that Western liberal democracies have changed their immigration politics, and they undercut values of both settlement and society. So there's no incentive anywhere to move away from the old story, and therefore we lose the opportunity to pay attention to some key changes, to actually see the new politics of immigration, and thus to work towards changing them. So I've been working at chipping away at the old mythology, not because it isn't valuable or isn't historically accurate, but because it stands in the way of a clearer view of what's happening in our contemporary politics. And it protects policymakers from a clear-headed critique of some contemporary choices. So really, what is new? The shorthand end of settler societies is useful because it captures two key changes: a devaluation, a focus on a loss of settlement and a loss of society. So we see the former, a loss of settlement, partially just in a retraction of settlement funding in all sorts of different ways, but really underlying that is an increasing focus on temporariness throughout migration programs all over the world. A rise of temporary entry programs like foreign workers and students, and permanent migration itself has been made increasingly difficult and increasingly fragile. The ways and the speeds with which one can lose permanent entitlement to remain here or anywhere else have really ratcheted up alarmingly in recent years. On the other side, the loss of society as a core value is also played out in some contemporary changes. So society here, I'm thinking about the immigration value of settling and belonging. Again, we can look at the cutbacks in settlement services, but these are the surface level. When we look a little bit deeper, we see some other shifts which really undercut the value of society. One is the rise of so-called illegal migration, and with it a massive category of people who are targeted for social exclusion regardless of how long they've been present somewhere. We also see increasing policy concern about ethnoburbs or ethnic enclaves, which have had a real uptick in the last two Canadian censuses, so over about the last decade. And these disrupt the traditional story of geographic integration over time. But neighborhoods where co-ethnics live together are a direct reflection of an immigration policy that focuses on attracting immigration actors who don't need to immigrate into a local economy, who are wealthy, whose ties are global, who really don't need anything from the society that they come to, and therefore can and indeed must bypass aspects of local integration because that's what we ask of them and is the basis on which we select them. So with these two changes comes a new politics of immigration, which is really characterized by intensity, urgency, and increased legality. So I guess, as I'm currently educating lawyers, there's an upside there, that there's a possible employment market, but not if we don't fund legal aid much better. I'm going to have to train them all to be legislative drafters, because that is certainly an exploding area. So we have these factors. Urgency, you can pick up any newspaper in any Western liberal democracy and you really won't go a week these days without finding an immigration story on the front page. Even even a decade ago, when I first tried writing about globalization and illegal migration, I had to look at a number of different newspapers to get that once in a week record, but now you can just stick with one. It really doesn't matter which one you choose. There's an enormous amount of legislative change, both in Canada and in a number of other places, and our pace of legislative change is actually relatively slow in comparison to jurisdictions like the UK or Australia. And then there really is this intensity of a higher stakes politics. So if we just look at the past, let's say 2.5 years, we see an enormous number of examples of this. And I won't take you through a whole series of examples from south of the border, but I think if you cast your mind very briefly to the Donald Trump regime, you will see very quickly the pickings are almost too easy. The way in which he was elected on the promise of an immigration ban, and has recently, probably the best example is the is the debacle of the separated children, which is now, this story has faded from the front pages, but has really not been resolved, and is a policy driven by a particular ruling that children are not to be detained. And so it really is a story, when one looks beneath it, of the most intense and perverse use of the law to drive forward that particular debacle. We could also spend time talking about Brexit, which is, of course, was a complete surprise to me, as to many others. And what drives forward much of the popular support for Brexit is a political posture regarding immigration. Nobody was campaigning that it would be a good idea to make trade more difficult into Britain, or to increase tariffs or put up economic barriers. That discourse has arisen, but was not part of what was happening before then. But most interestingly, and the part of my remarks that I really don't want to cut short, is what has happened under the Trudeau government in Canada. So here, it's very interesting and instructive to look at things that have changed since this government came into power, and things that have not changed since this government came into power. So we know that prior to the election at the end of 2015, we had gone through the most intensive decade of immigration regulatory change that Canada had ever seen, the fastest pace of change, and a real systematic dismantling of all sorts of core pieces of our immigration system. And then, thank goodness, a change of government, and like many others, I went, oh, thank God, it's over. However, if you look at what has actually changed with this government, we realize that some of the changes are really resistant to partisan change, and that we haven't seen a rollback of a lot of things. So here are a few things that have changed. Legislation about citizenship stripping. So thank goodness we can't do that anymore, but it had never been used, and even in Britain, where it's been around for 15 years, it's only been used 31 times so far. We got an increase, not nearly enough, not nearly persistent enough, but in refugee resettlement numbers. That's definitely a good thing. We got some, we had a rollback on refugee health care cuts, which was fabulous, but the provinces had largely stepped into that gap already, and a smart economist can do the math on that. And we got some changes on health inadmissibility, which for lawyers working in this area, we really were experienced with getting around many of those provisions through H&C, through humanitarian and compassionate applications. So a number of things changed, and all of those changes were good. But here are some things that didn't change. We haven't seen a repeal or much talk about removing a piece of legislation called the Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act. A piece of legislation that represents a massive change in how people affected by relatively low levels of criminality are targeted for removal from this country. We haven't seen any change in the Balanced Refugee Reform Act, the now new asylum system, and the now humming that we hear around the edges that there might be some sort of change is not talking about taking us back to the status quo ante that many of us were quite attached to, and that certainly would become attached to in retrospect. And we haven't seen Canada withdraw, for goodness sakes, from the Safe Third Country Agreement. What could we possibly be thinking there? We haven't seen a change in express entry, and we haven't seen changes to the 2009 Citizenship Act changes, which will mean that my grandchildren will be only Australian, quite possibly if my children follow my own life pattern, which is just, I think, personally annoying, but a delightful irony at a number of levels. So what this adds up to is that the changes that have been made by the Trudeau government are changes that are, on the one hand, symbolic, or possibly affecting a very few number of people, or possibly were essentially being done anyway. And the things that haven't changed are the things that affect massive numbers of people and are complete systemic overhauls. and that are fading into the background so quickly that many of us are not advocating in those directions anymore. I haven't talked very much about the Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act. I just am working on trying to figure out what to do with it now. And I itemize these things for myself as much as for anybody else, just to recall that although there are many reasons why I feel kindly disposed towards the current national government, its immigration politics are not among them. So, what is it exactly that we could possibly do to feel a little more optimistic at this time? I feel like some obligation given the hour to try and say a few optimistic things. So I'm going to try. And the older I get, the harder it is. What can I say? One of the things that I think is really interesting, we talk a lot about the value and importance of human rights. And I think one of the things that we can do within that story is to increasingly talk about a focus on the human in human rights. And I think if we look at the story of the Angela Merkel government and the way in which Angela Merkel has really tried and at many levels succeeded in clinging to some of the advances that she has made, it's by focusing not only on a legalistic framework, but actually on human beings and on more storytelling, more focus on people, less focus on the law. The state has an awful lot of power once we move exclusively into a legal discourse, and the human part of human rights is really valuable. We've also seen some very interesting changes that come from what's really an ugly story, and which is called by some scholars crimmigration. That is, that immigrants themselves have been criminalized so that a complete criminal law rhetoric just overshadows the whole immigration realm. One of the really interesting things there, and we did see it in a recent case before the Supreme Court of Canada, is the criminal law actually has quite strong protections for individuals. And if you go far enough down the crimination track, you end up with a decision like the Supreme Court of Canada's decision on human smuggling, which says, hey, wait a second. Once you start treating these people like criminals, oh my goodness, they have charter rights, they get into Section 7, you can't just make these assumptions. And that turned into a really interesting case because at the last minute, 5 unsuccessful judicial reviews in the Federal Court of Canada were joined up with one criminal case appeal from this jurisdiction, from British Columbia. And voila, a complete change in the law around human smuggling. So somewhere in that depth of crimmigration, there are a few good things. We should find them. And finally, I think it really is important to advocate in a very large way, not only in an incremental way, and this is super hard. And I'm really glad that this is not a room full of lawyers, because this is especially hard for lawyers, because lawyers, we always fight the fight that is in front of us and the incremental thing that we need right now. But it's really important not to forget the things that we were advocating for a decade ago, or 15 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago. And the thing I would really like to advocate for, but just to, the list could go on, but I'm particularly keen on an asylum-seeking visa globally. I think this would be a wonderful change in the way we structure this whole area, and I just want to say that I'm still capable of thinking of things that would actually make a revolutionary change. So go out there and change the world. Thank you.